Yes, so welcome to Lloyds Register Foundation Heritage and Education Centre virtually. So bit of housekeeping to begin with. I said apologies if any technology fails again. This is our first time doing this. So we're not really sure what we're doing or what's going on, but we're hoping that if this works, we're going to do some more. Also apologies if the postman knocks on the front door, or if the dog decides it suddenly wants attention. Obviously, I'm working from home, so anything can happen right now. If you have any questions, I see most of you found the questions tab on the control panel, so do pop any questions in there and I will answer them at the end of the talk. So these webinars, the online exhibitions that Sean mentioned, and also hopefully we're going to be doing some podcasts as well soon, just to give you a very sort of light touch, fun look at Lloyd's Register's history. This is our 260th birthday year, so it's a big one for Lloyd's Register. So we want to really just sort of celebrate our history and tell some different stories and hopefully get people interested. So we thought the best place to start would be in the beginning, at Edward Lloyd's Coffeehouse. So this webinar will cover the coffee house, the history of coffee houses, why they were so important, why they're so interesting, you know, why they were so popular in London, and what they led to. Then we'll look at Edward Lloyd himself, and then in his coffee house, how there were 3 Lloyds that started there. Then we're going to look at one character you would have seen in Edward Lloyd's coffee house, and that is John Julius Angerstein, who had a really interesting life and actually was quite important to our national history and culture. And then finally looking at the decline of the coffee house, what happened to them and what sort of replaced them, and why we ended up no longer being in the coffee house, which for many is probably a shame for those that work at Lloyd's Register and probably do spend their time in coffee shops anyway at the moment, or when working. So the history of coffee and coffee houses. In the 15th century, coffee became a really popular drink in the Middle East, spreading through the Ottoman Empire. Coffee houses were established in places like Mecca and Constantinople as places to not only drink coffee, but to have conversations and play board games. So they could be quite fun, lively places to be. Europeans visiting the Ottoman Empire, you know, for trade and all sorts of other reasons, would report back about a drink that was a black liquid and that acted like a stimulus. So you can imagine for Europeans, drinks they mainly had would have been beer, mead, wine. So this sort of strange substance would have been quite unusual for them and a bit of a sort of surprise. So those who had visited the Ottoman Empire were bringing back this coffee to England, to Europe. And as with other things that were brought into European countries, it was originally seen as a medicinal plant, a miracle cure. So it sort of was believed that it could cure melancholy, gout, smallpox, and excessive drunkenness. And I think many of us probably do use coffee still as a cure for excessive drunkenness today. So by the mid-17th century, coffee was no longer being seen as just a medicinal drink, but it was one that could be used for enjoyment and socialization. So Oxford, being that kind of weird place at the time full of thinkers, the Enlightenment, ideas, became the first English city to establish a coffee house. The first was called the Angel in 1652, and that was followed by Queen's Lane Coffee House, which is still in existence in Oxford, in 1654. So the image you can see, hopefully, on the screen is of a typical coffee house in the 17th century. So you can see the coffee pots in the background being warmed by the fire. You can see boys serving the coffee quite elegantly, I think, you know, beautifully being put in a cup. And then you can see the gentlemen there discussing all sorts of weird and wonderful things in the coffee house. So it looks like quite a vibrant, interesting place to be. The coffee houses in Oxford became known as penny universities. So scholars, philosophers, anyone sort of like that would meet with students in these coffee houses. You paid a penny for your cup of coffee, and then you would have a kind of informal learning environment. So that's why they became known as penny universities. So in 1652 as well, a rather eccentric man called Pasquale, who was the Greek servant of a merchant, opened the first coffee house in London near Cornhill. He had been to Turkey with the company he worked for, with his master, and became really obsessed with coffee as a drink, and thought, why not bring it back to London? It would be, you know, he could make something of it. So he did, and he opened his first coffee house in Cornhill. It's now the Old Jamaica Inn, if anyone's familiar with the area. So obviously, in order to make his business a success, he had to advertise coffee as being something that people wanted to drink. This was a new thing that many Londoners would never have seen before. So this pamphlet was produced to make people aware of what coffee actually was. And so we can see that coffee was grown on trees in the deserts of Arabia. It then goes on to talk about how coffee was made. So the beans were dried in an oven. They were then ground to powder, boiled with spring water, and about half a pint of it was to be drunk. And that you should fast before an hour before drinking coffee and an hour after. And that you had to drink it as hot as possibly can be endured. So yeah, sounds great. Then he sort of talks about the kind of customs around drinking coffee, that it's usually drunk in the mornings and about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And this was because it was believed it helped with digestion and stomach problems. And it was also, again, this idea of kind of a miracle cure medicine. It was believed to help all sorts of ailments, from problems with your head, headaches or feeling drowsy, consumption, lung problems, the king's evil, which was called scrofula. It could help pregnant women, it could help children, could help anything and everything, basically. So with sort of advertising coffee like this, Pasquale's coffee house became really popular. He served around 600 cups of coffee per day. And by 1663, there were 83 coffee houses just in the city of London. So, as I said, it is now the Old Jamaica Inn. If you go to the Old Jamaica Inn, you can see this plaque on the wall to sort of denote where Pasquale's first coffee house was. So, coffee houses in the late 17th century were places for debate. People became known as coffeehouse politicians. There was a fear amongst the authorities that men gathering in these coffee houses could be talking about ideas of revolution, treason, and dissent. So 1660, of course, saw the restoration of monarchy with Charles II, who you can see here. This came off the back of the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the rule of Oliver Cromwell. So you can imagine Charles II coming back in 1660. There would have been feelings of tension, and obviously that fear that a king wasn't, you know, God's anointed on earth. You know, he could answer to the people. He wasn't alone with that. Many in authority felt the same. And apparently so did women. They also had a fear or hatred for coffee. Whether or not this pamphlet was actually written by women is up for debate. Some say it was, and some say it was these sort of men that feared revolution that decided to put their hatred of coffee through the voice of women. Nevertheless, this pamphlet on the screen, printed in 1674, wrote about the newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee. Women believed that coffee made their husbands effeminate, and that it also made them impotent. That the men were as unfruitful as those deserts whence that unhappy berry is said to be brought. They also accused coffee of making men like women, that they would gabble and gossip, which, I mean, it possibly did, possibly still does today. But these pamphlets started sort of spreading about, and Charles decided to try and push through some legislation to ban coffee houses. He believed that men, good hard-working men, were wasting their time there. They weren't doing their jobs, and that they need to be closed down. This was met with an outcry. Coffee houses were so popular, even with really influential people in Stuart London, like someone like Samuel Pepys. So Charles never published this legislation, and coffee houses could continue to grow. So we move into the 18th century, and specifically in London. By the early 18th century, London boasted more coffee houses than any other city outside of the Ottoman Empire. So as you can imagine, this was an incredibly popular pastime for people. They were very cheap, you paid a penny. They were lively, they were full of debate, conversation, politics, philosophy, business. Certain coffee houses attracted certain types of clientele and business. So we have some examples on the screen. Nando's Coffee House was located on Fleet Street. And if you look at the bottom, where you can sort of see a lady serving coffee and some men in wigs. This coffee house was really popular with the legal profession. So these are judges, because it was located nearby the courts and chambers. Button's Coffee House on Russell Street was a place where playwrights and poets went. So it was a very creative atmosphere, full of discussing, you know, a new play or poem or work of literature. Then we have this rather lovely looking woman called Moll King. Moll King's Coffee House, originally Tom King's Coffee House, her husband before he died, was located in Covent Garden. And this was a coffee house where pimps, prostitutes and customers would meet there. This would often happen after a night of drinking. Customers could have a cup of coffee and browse a well put together pamphlet of prostitutes, pick one and then head off site with the prostitute. Bit of a questionable coffee house. Never did get in trouble quite a lot actually, for sort of fighting and debauchery, but was never closed down for being a brothel because Moll King made sure that they never had beds on site. So it couldn't be a brothel. The Folly of the Thames, which you can see in the top left and next to it, was a floating coffee house moored outside Somerset House. And this coffee house also had a reputation for partying and debauchery. It's amazing what coffee can do to people, it really is. These coffee houses were smoky, loud, sweaty places. They were places where people were judged for their clothes, their opinions, or work. So, for example, politicians who might have just given a speech in Westminster would often try to avoid the coffee houses around Parliament following it, just in case they were sort of accosted or you know, shouted at or questioned or insulted. So yeah, so sort of really vibrant places. It's no wonder that coffee houses became places where businesses were created, you know, ideas circulated, conversations could be had. So several great institutions that are still around today owe their existence to these coffee houses, like the London Stock Exchange, Sotheby's, Christie's, Lloyds of London, and of course, Lloyd's Register. So Maximilian Misson, who was a French writer, this is a quote from him, which I think quite nicely summarises the nature of a coffee house. You have all manner of news there. You have a good fire, which you may sit by as long as you please. You have a dish of coffee, you meet your friends for the transaction of business, and all for a penny if you don't care to spend more. Sorry, dealing with technology there. So with these coffee houses, other sorts of people started opening them up. And we, of course, have Edward Lloyd. We don't know too much about Lloyd's early life, but we do know that in his early 30s, he arrived in London in around 1680. And within 8 years, he opened his first coffee house on Tower Street. So this is an extract from the London Gazette in 1689, the first, we believe the first reference to Lloyd's Coffee House. And it's basically just sort of someone's had their parchment book with several bills and bits and pieces inside of it stolen, and they would like it returned to Lloyd's Coffee House, where they would usually be for a substantial reward. So in 1691, Lloyd moved his coffee house to 16 Lombard Street. And this is where it really began to achieve the reputation as a centre of those interested and involved with shipping. So as I said before, different types of coffee houses attracted different people, businesses and clientele. And Lloyd's was the one where anyone involved in maritime wanted to be. Lloyd being a, you know, entrepreneurial, he cemented his coffee house with this reputation by ensuring that shipping news was readily available and provided. So you can see on the screen a map of that part of London with Lloyd's Coffee House second move onto Lombard Street. The Lloyd's Register headquarters today sit at the top of Fenchurch Street. So you can kind of see by the map, we didn't move very far from the coffee house, though we've had several offices sort of around that area. We're still very close to where we started, which is quite a nice sort of feeling. Lloyd's Coffee House prospered throughout the start of the 18th century, and Lloyd himself became a really respected member of the local community. He was active in the city parish and became a church warden. And in 1710 and 1711, he was nominated as a common councilman for the city corporation. He was unsuccessful on both occasions, but to be nominated was a significant achievement. In 1713, with his health in decline, Lloyd made a will, and he assigned the lease of the coffee house to his head waiter, William Newton. Lloyd's daughter, Handy, had married Newton, meaning that when Lloyd died, the coffee house would continue in the Lloyd name. However, tragedy struck the Lloyd family, and in February 1713, Lloyd died. The following year, Newton died. Handy ended up remarrying a man called Samuel Shepherd, so they kept the Lloyd's Coffee House, but she died in 1720. The coffee house then passed out of the immediate Lloyd family to Handy's in-laws, and they then, the subsequent owners after that. The name stayed as Lloyd's Coffee House. The name Lloyd was so important, it had such a good reputation, so there was no sense in changing the name. So it stayed as Lloyd's Coffee House. So not only were coffee houses places where people did business, they tended to work as an office. Businessmen in the 18th century didn't really have offices as we would know them today. It would just be the coffee house. So post was often just sent there. And as we can see from this letter in our archive, addressed to James Gordon Esquire at Lloyd's Coffee House in London. So, I mean, yeah, it's quite a nice thing to do. So, in Lloyd's Coffee House, we have the story of 3 organisations with the name Lloyd's. Lloyd's List, Lloyds of London, and Lloyd's Register. Now, we at Lloyd's Register often get mistaken for being Lloyds of London. We've also been mistaken for being Lloyd's Bank and Lloyd's Pharmacy. We have nothing to do with the bank or the pharmacy, and we're not Lloyds of London. But these 3 organisations did start in the same coffee house. So Lloyd's List gathered shipping news, intelligence, and analytics, and it's still being produced today. Lloyds of London, of course, monopolised on the marine insurance market. So because you've got mariners gathering in the coffee house, insurers could gather there as well, and you could start selling insurance across the coffee house. It could be quite lively, but that's how it started. Obviously, Lloyds of London is still operating today, not too far from the original site of the coffee house. So again, not moving very far from where we all started. The image you can see on the screen is from the 1936 film Lloyds of London, which was inspired by the history of the insurance company. It follows the story of Jonathan Blake, who was best friends with Horatio Nelson in the film. They overhear a plot involving insurance fraud, so Blake runs to London, goes to the coffee house, tells them what's going on, and he is rewarded by being given a job as an underwriter and works at Lloyds of London. Then the film follows his life working in insurance, culminating in the Battle of Trafalgar. So do give it a watch if you've never watched it before. It's certainly a very interesting patriotic sort of film, very typical of the 1930s. So then we have Lloyd's Register. Now, Lloyd's Register, as I said before, of course, started in the coffee house. The 18th century saw ships going further than they ever had before. This meant that it was more treacherous for ships. Cargo was being lost, people's lives were being lost. So a group of men in the coffee house sort of thought, well, why don't we check ships before they sail, make sure they're safe and seaworthy, which to us seems like a really sensible idea. I'm not getting on any ship or in a plane or in a car that I don't know is safe. But this was a completely new idea. So in 1760, the Society for the Registry of Shipping was established. What you see on the screen is a page from the 1764 register book, the oldest that survives and is in our collection. So you can see it's a very simple list of name, owner, ports, tonnage, all sorts of information, and the all-important classification at the end. I'm not going to talk too much more about sort of classification and surveying. My colleague Max is going to be doing another webinar, fingers crossed everything works, in a couple of weeks, looking at kind of the early work of Lloyd's Register. And you can also find out more information about surveying and the register books on our website. But this was, where we differed from Lloyds of London and Lloyd's List. So another example of correspondence going to and from, to the coffee house. So this was a letter from Madeira of ships that have passed through that port with a breakdown of the vessel's details, sort of in the format of the register book you can see on the left. The interesting thing about this letter is that it was delayed in reaching its final destination because it had been intercepted by an American privateer carried into Gibraltar and then was forwarded from there. So it's quite an interesting little story that we have in our archive. So one character, as I mentioned, you would have seen at Lloyd's Coffee House was a chap called John Julius Angerstein. He was born in 1735 in Russia. There were rumours around his parentage. It was believed his mother could have been Catherine II of Russia or Elizabeth of Russia. but it is actually believed that he was the son of Anna of Russia and Andrew Thompson. In 1749, he emigrated to England and took up a position at Thompson's counting house. And then by the age of 21, he was introduced to Lloyd's Coffeehouse. And from there, he became a skilled underwriter and amassed a huge personal fortune. He was the sort of man that if you went to Lloyd's Coffeehouse, you wanted to see, you wanted to talk to and be with. He was incredibly respected to those in the business. He was instrumental in the modernisation of Lloyds of London and of Lloyd's Register, making sure that both became professional, distinguished organisations, and served as chairman for both organisations, so really important to our history. He was incredibly charitable. He sat on the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. He inspired the creation of the Lifeboat Fund at Lloyd. He became vice president of the London Institution, which became the London University, and he was chairman of the Lloyd's Patriotic Fund. Outside of all of that, as if he didn't have enough to do, because of his huge fortune, he was an avid collector of art and had a collection that had paintings from Titian, Rembrandt and Van Dyck. And on his death in 1823, he donated his collection to the public, which in turn led to the formation of the National Gallery. So now we come to the rather sad end of the coffee houses, these once sort of vibrant places. In 1678, Lloyd's Register moved to a new office at number 4 Suncourt, Cornhill, and Lloyds of London moved out as well in the 1770s into new offices at the Royal Exchange. This matched a much wider trend of businesses purchasing offices to do their business in rather than the coffee house. Coffee houses then started to decline. Some people still visited them, they were still being used, but news was now being got from newspapers, and there was a rise in other entertainments like pleasure gardens, theatres, so there was no need for the coffee house anymore. So Lloyd's Coffee House ceased operation in 1785. And whenever you get a chance to wander back around the City of London, if you go down Lombard Street and find a Sainsbury's, you'll see this plaque on the wall outside, and that's where Lloyd's Coffee House once stood. After 1785, the coffee house was neglected, and in 1837, a fire broke out at the Royal Exchange. It's noted in Queen Victoria's journal on the 22nd of January 1838 that when she went down to see the site following the fire, the Lord Mayor was there with her, and she asked him where the fire came from, why did it happen, and it was believed that it arose from neglect in the Lloyd's Coffee House. So yeah, unfortunately, because of the neglect there, buildings in London that were no longer being used could cause some issues. So that, on that rather sort of unfortunate note with the end of the coffee houses, brings an end to the presentation. There's of course so much more about coffee houses and coffee house culture and coffee house history that I can't really go into right now because of timing. But if you are interested, there are some books currently listed on the screen and in the handout, which you can download. They're in there as well. So do feel free to give them a read. Before I start answering questions, the next talk is called That's A1, the Early History of Lloyd's Register, on the 7th of May, again at 1 p.m. And that will be with my colleague Max, who will be talking about the early work of Lloyd's Register and kind of why use of ships. And then just, links to the archive, to the Lloyd's Register Foundation and to Lloyd's Register for more information. So thank you for listening to the main part of the presentation. I I'm going to see if I can answer questions. A lot of this is, I can hear you now, which is good. Thank you. Yes, we aim to have a recording of this presentation to be available on the website. Nowadays, people in the UK drink a lot of tea. Was that the case in the 18th century? Yes, of course, Britain today is known for its tea drinking and coffee as well now, but mainly tea. Tea was becoming popular in the 18th century thanks to the British East India Company, but it was seen as a domestic drink and one for the middle and upper classes. So Twinings did have a tea shop in the early 1700s in London, and tea would be taken home, and part of this kind of really outrageous sort of afternoon tea ritual. It was also seen as sort of quite patriotic, drinking tea. Then towards the end of the 18th century, with the decline of coffee houses, part of the reason for that was coffee was difficult to make at home or easily or cheaply, whereas tea was cheaper and easier to make. And then it kind of became a fuel for the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, hopefully that's helped answer that question. The website for the registration for the next talk is on our website. So that is hec.lrfoundation.org.uk. There will be an email coming out tomorrow, I believe, that webinar sort of send as an automatic, like, thank you for attending, where I've put the link for the next talk in that one. And also through that, please do email me back with any other questions, any further reading, any comments, if anything we can be improved on. Obviously, working microphones would be a really good one. I think that's it for questions. Yeah, so I hope everyone enjoyed that. Oh, it was, how much was a cup of coffee back then? It was a penny, just a penny apparently. Yeah, which seems quite cheap. I wish it was a penny now. Yeah, if there's nothing else from anyone, I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, I hope you can attend our future exhibitions. Make sure you visit our website to look at our online exhibitions and stories, as Sean mentioned before, and do check out our digitisation with all of our documents. There's more being uploaded all the time. So thank you very much for listening. I will end the webinar now, hopefully.